Hey everybody, this is Christian and today we're diving into central log management with Grafana Loki. If you're sick of running through multiple places like logging into remote servers, dangling through the different log files and trying to search for something using basic terminal tools, trust me guys, this is the right video for you. Because Grafana Loki makes log management so freaking easy, you can access any log files from Docker containers to different server syslogs, whatever you need, from one central place where you can easily filter and search for exactly the part that you're looking for. This is absolutely amazing, and as you can imagine, this is super important to know and use in professional IT environments. But of course, it's also a huge help in your home labs as well. I've just deployed Grafana Loki in my home lab environment and connected it to my existing Grafana Monitoring System that makes troubleshooting issues on my servers and containers so much easier. And today I'm going to show you how to set this up securely, of course. So we'll use the Traefik reverse proxy with trusted TLS certificates to encrypt all the data, and we can even throw Authentik in the mix to make sure all our systems are protected with a secure machine-to-machine authentication. I know this requires many different components and technologies to have in place from previous videos, so if you haven't watched them, especially the Grafana, Traefik and Authentik tutorials, I will leave you a link to them in the description box down below so you can follow this video. But if you've gone through all of this, in the end you should have a solid and secure central log management system for your IT environments, so I hope you're gonna enjoy it. And if you're wondering how to connect all the different target devices and services you want to collect logs from to your local network environment, I want to show you what I'm using in my home lab, because if you want simple and secure remote access, I think there's no better service than TwinGate, the sponsor of today's video. TwinGate is a zero-trust network access platform that beats all traditional VPNs because it is so much more secure and also simpler to set up. Every access request that leaves your devices has to be authorized, so if it isn't, or if your device looks a bit sketchy, TwinGate won't let the request even go through, and it even works through NAT devices and firewalls without any port forwardings required or firewall exceptions. It is super smart. For example, if you are running a local web server or you want to connect over SSH to your local machines, TwinGate makes it super easy to access it securely. And the best is, you can use TwinGate completely for free with up to 5 users and connect to 10 different remote networks. If you want to check it out, I've put together a few tutorials on TwinGate on how to set it up and use it in your Docker, Kubernetes or DevOps environments. So definitely check it out and start securing your network. Of course, I'll drop you a link to the website in the description down below. Alright guys, so now let's get started with Grafana Loki and central log management. First of all, I want to give you a quick overview of what central log management actually means, why do we use it in IT, and how does it generally work. Now, Grafana Loki is what we call a horizontally scalable, high-available, multi-tenant log aggregation system that has been inspired by Prometheus. So for those of you who don't know Prometheus, this is another pretty popular tool that we use in IT to collect and aggregate metrics from different types of systems. Now, to quickly explain what is the difference between logs and metrics, metrics are kind of statistics that are reported by services, applications, or systems, something like how high is the CPU load, or how much is the memory or disk utilization, how many users are currently logged into your system. And all of these statistics and reportings can be collected and aggregated in a huge database using Prometheus. And then you can search and filter through that database, query information. You can also use the Grafana system to visualize and get some better insight into performance and those kind of things of your systems. And what Prometheus is for metrics, Grafana Loki is somewhat for logs. So this is also a huge database where you collect and ingest all the different logs that are created on your servers or created by your applications. And they often contain information about errors that occur at a specific time, but also informational things, warnings, traces. So this is super useful to troubleshoot and follow the execution path of a program to find out at which point something went wrong. So as you can imagine, this is also super important in IT environments. So we actually need both. We need metrics for performance statistics, and we need logs to troubleshoot systems when something went wrong or getting alerts about specific events that occur on our systems. Now, one of the biggest differences between Grafana Loki and other competitive log aggregation systems, something like Elasticsearch, for example, is that Grafana Loki is designed to be a bit simpler and cost-effective. So it doesn't index the entire content of your logs. It is only attaching labels to it that are indexed, making it faster and consuming less resources. I've also created a short presentation of the architecture of Grafana Loki to explain how the different components work and how they interact with each other. So in the middle we have Grafana Loki. This is the huge database that contains and manages all the logs from the different systems. Here on the left side you can see we can use a bunch of different log collectors, something like Promptail, which is a very simple service application that can scrape through all the different files, grab everything that it finds there and sends it to Grafana Loki, attached with the right label so you can later find out what was the location, what was the time, and which service or which log file does it come from. There's also another pretty cool thing that is also a reason why I wanted to get my head around Grafana Loki, and this is the Docker plugin. So you can also easily collect all the different logs that the container applications write to your system and also send this all to Grafana Loki with attaching the labels for each container, so you can easily filter and search for anything that has been logged on your container orchestration systems. It's super useful. By the way, these are not the only log collectors that are existing for Grafana Loki. There are many, many more. As you can imagine, there is something like Grafana Alloy. So this is kind of a more complex and new application that is aiming to replace Promptail and also has a bunch of other different features, something like integrations with Kubernetes and stuff. But honestly, I didn't want to be too complicated in the first video, so we will start with those two log collectors. We will connect the Docker plugin and Promptail, so this is probably the most simple way to start. But just know there are other log collectors, so you can add your Kubernetes logs and send it to Grafana Loki. You can add custom log collectors that go through specific applications or specific files that you are defining. And then when Grafana Loki receives all the logs, it will store it somewhere in a central storage location. So there are different types of storage options as well. For example, in S3 bucket, Google Cloud Storage, and you can just write it to the file system. Now, one thing you should keep in mind for these different types of storage systems is that the file system isn't really recommended in production, but we will use it, as I don't want to use a cloud storage for this demonstration. If you want to find out more about the storage options, there's also a great documentation page that will explain what are the two different types of data. So in Grafana Loki, there are data chunks and data indexes, and these are two different types of storage. To quickly explain, when Grafana Loki receives all the logs, you can imagine this can grow up lot in size, and to make it efficient, it is using these labels and stores them in an index storage. And the index just contains all the necessary data to find the relevant log file. So it has a link to the actual content of the logs that is stored in the chunk data in a compressed format. And this you can store in production systems in an S3 bucket, GCS, all of these cloud things. But as I said previously, I don't like using these cloud systems in my home lab. I'm just using a simple file system. And to quickly return to the presentation, there's also another component that you might need, and this is the Grafana dashboard. Most of you guys probably have it already running in your home labs because I've made a video about Grafana and how to visualize metrics in Prometheus or InfluxDB using the Grafana dashboard. The cool thing about Grafana Loki is that you don't need another dashboard, you don't need another graphical user interface. You can just connect Grafana Loki to your existing Grafana instance. So that is also one of the reasons why I picked Grafana Loki instead of other log aggregation systems, because I'm running Grafana dashboard already. I absolutely love it, and I think it just was the best decision to use Grafana Loki because I can easily connect these two systems, and then I have my metrics and my logs in one central place. I think this is absolutely fantastic. And there's also another cool advantage if you want to visualize logs and you're familiar with Prometheus. If you know PromQL, you are also familiar with LogQL. So there's no new language that you need to learn. But don't worry, if you're not familiar with these query languages, I don't know them myself either. So we're not covering it in this video, maybe in a future video, but for this video, you just need those components here. And to make it a bit more secure, of course, we are throwing in Traefik and also Authentik. but those two things are kind of optional. Alright, so that's it about the presentation. Don't worry, there's just one more theoretical part that we need to cover before jumping into the terminal and get it up and running. So we need to cover how to set this whole thing up, because Grafana Loki might sound like a simple and easy log aggregation system, but it can get complicated as well if you really drill into all the different components. So there are different types of Loki deployment modes, depending on what you want in your environment. First, there is the monolithic mode. This is, by the way, also the most simple mode and the mode that we are covering in this tutorial, so don't worry, it's not getting too complicated. But the monolithic mode actually runs all the different components inside a single process or container, which is great for single server environments if you want to set up Grafana Loki in a Docker container. And this can handle approximately about 20 gigabytes per day. So this is already pretty sophisticated and can work in even smaller professional environments as well. And by the way, if you want to combine this with a shared volume, something like NFS or S3, you could also scale this as well. You shouldn't underestimate this setup, right? But if you have something like a Kubernetes cluster already deployed somewhere and you want to make Grafana Loki high available and to make it support a lot more data, you can use the simple scalable mode by using the Loki Helm chart. So I haven't tested this yet in my home lab. Maybe I'll do that, but this will just run it in Kubernetes, and this supports things like high availability, auto scaling. It is able to process larger files up to a few terabyte logs per day. So this is probably what you would use in a mid-size company, enterprise environment, whatever you want to call it. And if you really want to get crazy, I don't think anybody will do this, but you can also theoretically set it up in microservices mode, which means you run all of these individual components as separate processes or containers that you can all scale as much as you need. But just know, yeah, this is for really the big enterprise companies. And honestly, yeah, we're not diving into this topic today, don't worry. Alright, so to get it up and running, you can use the installation documentation that Grafana Loki provides. It's not bad, it's pretty good. But honestly, I don't want to go through this because I think that most of you guys will have a running Docker setup if you're watching and following my videos. You probably have Grafana, Traefik, and Docker and all of these things running. If you don't, well, I've collected a list with all the previous videos that you need. Link is in the description. And I don't want to use this tutorial. Instead, I will point you to my boilerplates repository where I'm collecting snippets and configurations for all different technologies that we are covering here on this channel. So for example, if you go to Docker Compose, I've created a new directory called Loki. Here you'll find a Docker Compose file that we can use. All right, so now I want to set this up and I want to use my testing server for this. So on this testing server, I'm already running a Traefik instance that we can use to expose Grafana Loki securely with TLS certificates. And then we can connect all the different log collectors from different servers or infrastructure. I think this is a good way to set up. And let me first create a new directory that I call Loki and cd into this project. And of course, I'm also going to open this on my new code editor. And let's create a new compose file in the Loki directory on my testing server. So in here, of course, I will copy and paste everything from my boilerplates templates so we can get started. What we also need is a config file. So here I'm going to create a new config directory and a config.yaml file and paste the content from my boilerplate. So here in the config directory, you can find an example configuration file. So let me just go through the two files so you know what is happening inside here. This command here will tell Grafana Loki to start with the config.yaml file that we will put in the etc Loki directory. So if you scroll down, you can see I am creating a new mount point that mounts the config file from the current project directory config.yaml inside the containers file system at this position, etc Loki config.yaml as read-only mode. So then it starts with the configuration that you put in this file. And then we also need a volume to store the logs. Again, if we go into the config file, you can see that I'm using the tsdb storage, so what is recommended for the index store, and for the object store, so that is the file system. So everything in the /Loki directory inside the containers file system, you have to put in a Docker volume. And just to complete this config file, so I've mostly copied everything that you find in here from the official documentation. So I've not made any big changes to this, but you can, of course, also go into the official documentation here, and then you can find information about all the different configuration settings, best practices, examples, and so on. So I'm not going through all of this because the example that I found from the single monolithic deployment, that seems to work great in my setup. So you can basically just leave this config file as it is. You don't need to change anything in here. One thing you might know from my videos and tutorials, I'm always including the Traefik reverse proxy whenever I can, because it allows you to securely expose any Docker containers with trusted TLS certificates. Because by default, when you expose the port 3100 Grafana Loki, this is using a web service. So therefore, I think it is not a good idea to just expose the port 3100. It has no authentication, it has no encryption, and it's not stopping anyone from just connecting to this service and gather all the log files from your system. So I think it is a good idea to secure this connection. And the first step to secure this is remove the ports part. When the Traefik reverse proxy is running on the same Docker host, you can just easily uncomment these lines here. Make sure that you set the network front end according to your Docker network where Traefik is running. And then it is also important that you customize these labels a bit. So the first one will enable Traefik to look for any config labels on this container. The second one will set the internal server port of the Loki service to port 3100. And the next labels are for the Traefik router. So I will create a new router called Loki for the entry points web secure. So I only want to expose it on TLS and not the unencrypted HTTPS port. And here in the host rule, you can set your rule. So in my case, I'm using an FQDN that I've created on my local DNS server, and that will resolve everything, so every subdomain in front of the server test1.home.crave.de to the internal IP address of the server where we want to deploy Loki. I want to add a new name for this. Let's just give it the name Loki. I think that's fine. And then, of course, I want to enable TLS. I want to issue a new trusted TLS certificate. And then what we can also do is we can enable an Authentik middleware. But I'm not going through this now. I just want to set it up using TLS, and we'll talk about basic authentication in a few minutes, right? Okay, so let's get this up and running because I think this is all we need. So everything should be correct. And let's go in this project directory and just run a docker compose up-d. So this will pull down the latest image of the Loki container and start it. So now our logging system should already be up and running. That's fine. And if you have Grafana set up in your system, by the way, I'm not going through the setup of Grafana in this tutorial because I've made a tutorial about it already. So Grafana, again, this is the visualizing dashboard I'm using for all the metrics. And you need to go to data sources. Here you can see my Loki production system is running. And we want to add a new data source, search for Loki. Click on that, set the URL to the FQDN. So I will just copy the same name as I configured here with HTTPS, of course, so not HTTP. We have no authentication method configured yet. Let's click on Save and Test. And if you configured everything correctly, if Grafana Loki is up and running, you should see data source successfully connected. Now you can start visualizing the data, you can start building a dashboard, or you can query the data of Grafana Loki in the Explore view. So that's what we're going to do. So if we go in here, that's, by the way, on the left menu here, Explore. So now you can select the data source, Loki, and build your query. But because we haven't added any data here, because the Grafana Loki is completely empty, we first need to send logs to it. There's nothing in here I could show you. So I'm going to show you that on my production system. So let me go to logs here. And then in the data source, I will select my production system so you can see what it's gonna look like. Here you can see I have 3 containers that currently have sent logs to Grafana Loki in the last 50 minutes. So if you go in here, you can filter it. You can also go back in time as long as you need, or as long as Loki has data collected. And now you can also drill deeper into this system. So for example, if I want to troubleshoot the error logs in the Cloudflare D production container, I can click on show logs and this will open all the relevant logs in a new window. If I want to drill further into these log lines, the cool thing is in Grafana, you can also just mark the time range that you want to see. And then you are zooming in. And here you can see Grafana Loki also tries to attach severity labels to these logs. So it is important to know that this does not always work. I will also show you some other examples where you cannot really see the severity level because as I said in the beginning, this is a difference between a labeled attaching system and a system like Elasticsearch that will index everything from the logs. And some services have their own ways of sending logs to the system. Some report the severity, some don't. Some do it in a weird format or in a weird way that Grafana Loki doesn't understand and so on. So it is somewhat specific based on what service reports logs in which specific format. But here, for example, this is a good example. As we can see, some are green, but that means unknown. So we don't know the severity. As we can see here in the log content, these are info severities. There are warnings in here, and these warnings seem to be interpreted as errors because it finds the word error somewhere here in the logs. You can see connection terminated, application error, whatever that means, but it seems like a network error. Maybe the application was down at this time and Cloudflare couldn't connect to this application. Now, let's go back to other logs. As you can see, other logs might report a lot of data as, for example, GitLab. GitLab is absolutely crazy, and you can see this system is absolutely capable of handling thousands of log lines. And yeah, then you can go through the log lines and try to find out what's going wrong, but I'm not going to do that with GitLab. It's working fine, so I'm not going to touch it. Maybe we can drill into other logs here. If we mark this occurrence here, for example, you can see failed to serve tunnel, no network activities, so this has to be a network issue. But there's also a Python interpreter error somewhere in my Ansible automation workflows. So I can now go in here, drill further into this. Here you can see the fields, so the labels that have been attached by the log collectors of Grafana Loki. Here you can see what is the Docker container that reported this line, what is the compose service and the compose project name. And if you go to explore, this is a query for the filters that we have applied via the visualization. And here you can now download this and export it to text file, JSON, CSV, and further drill into these logs and try to find out what has happened on your machine and what is going wrong. You probably cannot wait to know how to send logs to this system. And let's do this for our test appliance here. So as I said in the beginning, there are different types of log collectors. And I first of all want to start with the Docker plugin, so the Docker driver client. Grafana Loki officially supports Docker with a plugin, and this is probably the most simple way to send logs to Grafana Loki. If you're already using containerized application, that just makes the most sense. And it's really easy to install, so you just copy this line here that will install the Docker plugin on your machine. As you can see, I already pulled down the plugin. So when you enter Docker plugin ls, you can see the Loki logging driver is already installed. One thing that is important to understand here is how to configure the logging driver. There are two options that you can use on how to configure this. You can either configure it for each container that you're running, or you can change the default logging driver in the daemon.json file of the Docker engine. If you do this here, so you go in here and edit this daemon.json file if you're using it, then all newly created Docker containers will automatically send logs to Grafana Loki. Note, just newly created container, not existing ones. So therefore, I don't really like this approach because sometimes I also have temporary containers running on the system, something like automation workflow runners and things that are frequently created and deleted. So I don't want to see all these logs in my Grafana Loki system. I just want to see things that I care about. So therefore, my preferred option is to attach labels to each of the individual projects. And let's try to do this. Let's go in my server because there is also an Nginx container running. So this is an Nginx web server, and maybe I want to collect logs from that server to find out if I enable an access log. So who has accessed my web page, or maybe if there is an error on my web server. So let's switch to this Docker Compose project. And I just need to do one thing. First of all, I'm going to shut down the container, because this is a good idea to do before you make any changes to the compose file. And then you just add the sections for adding a logging option and configure a new driver that you call Loki if you want. So it's up to you how you call it. And then configure the logging options. So the most important option is the Loki URL. So this is the URL where to send logs to. If you remember, we are exposing the Grafana Loki service using Traefik. So we can basically just copy the data source URL that we've used in Grafana to connect to this. However, it is important that you also append the full path, because Grafana Loki expects logs to arrive at a specific API endpoint, which is Loki/API version 1 push. So this is the full path where you can send logs to Grafana Loki. And basically this would now work, but there is another thing that I need to tell you, and I know not many tutorials include this. There is a known issue, a known limitation with the logging driver. If the access point where you try to send logs to is not available, for example, when you restart the Traefik container or you stop Grafana Loki, it will run into a deadlock. And this will completely make it impossible to stop and start new containers. You have to shut down the entire Docker daemon and then restart everything. It is really a stupid and ugly thing. It is described in the documentation. So this recommends to lower the wait time for the timeouts, lower the number of retries. So let's go back in here and make sure that we attach these options as well to our configuration, and we set the mode to non-blocking. So that's everything we need. Make sure to attach this to every container that you want to use to send logs to Loki. All right, so let's save this file and let's go to my server, and now we restart the Nginx daemon, set it up. So you won't see any specific message in here. You can just know if that's working when you go to Grafana. So remember, we already added the data source, so we can go to logs and select data source. Let's try to refresh it. And yeah, there you can see the logs from the Nginx server have arrived at our Grafana Loki database. So if we go and drill further into this, you can see these are just a few informational logs. This all looks fine. Perfect. And just like this, you can just go through all of your Docker containers. By the way, because we've used Traefik to expose it securely on your entire local network, it does not matter on which server your container is running. So you can just append these lines here to all other containers. I just want to demonstrate how that's working in Traefik, for example. So the Traefik container is running on the same system. Let's also do it. And by the way, if you wouldn't have set up these options, I would now run into this weird deadlock state, because I will stop the Traefik container that is used to expose Loki. I will append the logging options here, save this file, and then restart the Traefik container. And if we go in here, just refresh it, it should immediately work. And there you see also the Traefik logs are arriving. So yeah, if you repeat this on all your environments, you have all the logs centralized in Grafana Loki. You can use Grafana to query it, visualize it. You can try to build dashboards if you like. I haven't done it because I mostly go through the logs using the explore logs method. I think that is totally sufficient. Now, there is another important topic that I want to cover and address at this point, because one might think, all right, this is perfect. I just go at all the different containers, send the logs to Grafana Loki. Perfect, I'm done, right? But just keep in mind, we haven't secured the system yet. We have added trusted TLS certificates. We're using an encrypted tunnel to send the logs to, so no one in between can sniff the log files that we're sending. But anyone can still connect to Grafana Loki and gather all the log files that we are sending. And this might be a big security issue, because some services and applications might log weird things, right? So some might expose credentials in debug logs. And of course, we're not stopping anyone from just connecting to Grafana Loki and collecting this stuff, or sending a million log files to our system and break it. So therefore, I think it is good to have a strong and secure authentication. And if you've watched my previous videos, you know that I'm using the free and open source IDP provider Authentik to log in to all of my systems securely. So when I want to log into Grafana, I need to authenticate to Authentik with multi-factor authentication, a strong password. The same I do for all the other services in here. And if you've watched my Authentik Outpost video, you should also have a great foundation to connect to all applications you expose via Traefik and protect them with a login form using Authentik, no matter where they are deployed. And the cool thing in Authentik is the Authentik proxy outpost that we've covered in my last Authentik tutorial. This also can be used for HTTP basic authentication, so you cannot just use it with a login form, you can also implement a secure machine-to-machine authentication. What does machine-to-machine authentication mean? Actually pretty simple. When you want to send logs from one machine to another machine, but the machine that sends the logs has to be authenticated with a token or with a username and password, and this is also pretty easily possible in Authentik. Now, if you're not using Authentik, don't worry, you can skip this step. I will put timestamps in the description of the video, so just skip the Authentik part. But just know, I would strongly recommend you to set it up at some point in the future. Just a short recap how you're generally doing this. So in Traefik, I have configured a middleware that is called Authentik. This will forward all the authentication requests to my Authentik outpost that is deployed on the same server. And this authenticates each and every request. And what I can do to make sure that the container is secured behind a login form is I attach this middleware to the individual container that I want to protect. And I create an application and provider for this in Authentik. Let's quickly do this together for Grafana Loki. So first of all, I need to go back to my server, cd into the Loki project, take the compose project down. So this is now stopping the container. So if I go back in here, you might remember I already added a template for this. So I will uncomment this line. Make sure that the router name matches and that the middleware name matches with what you have configured here. So in my case, this does not match. So I might have to update my template. So here, the name of the middleware is just Authentik. I just need to remove the dash middleware at the end and call it Authentik file. Okay, cool. So now we can save, but we are not done yet. So we need to go to Authentik, of course, go to the administration interface and create a new application provider and attach this to the outpost running on the server. So let's go in here, application providers. I'm going to create a new proxy provider that I'm going to call Loki. The authorization flow is implicit. I think that doesn't really matter for machine-to-machine communication. Then forward auth, and this is the FQDN, the external address. I'm lazy, I will just use what I have defined in the data source here. So we don't need to fill in anything into the advanced protocol settings. I think this is just fine. And then, of course, when we created a provider, we also need to create an application. Select the provider that we have just created, and then create the application. All right, so now that we have the application and provider, we can go to the outposts. So here are all of my outposts that I have deployed for all the individual servers that are running in my home lab. And of course, we want to protect the Loki application on the server test 1. So this is where Grafana Loki is running, and move this application to the selected apps. There's nothing else we need to do, just click update, and now Authentik will start protecting Loki. We, of course, need to start the container up again. And if you want to test if that's working, what you have configured, you just open a new browser window and try to access the URL of Grafana Loki. And then you should be redirected to Authentik, so that you need to fill in a username and password to get access to the Grafana Loki instance. So now comes the part with the machine-to-machine communication, because any Docker container that tries to send logs to this location cannot authenticate with a username and password in here, right? So therefore, we need to use what is called the HTTP basic authentication method in the proxy outpost. And the way how you enable this in Authentik is also pretty simple. You just go into the directory and go to tokens and app passwords. Because the proxy outpost already accepts the HTTP basic auth, you just need to create a token or a username and password for the basic authentication credentials that you're going to use in the logging driver. So let's click on create, and we can give it an identifier. So I will just call it Loki test1, app, password, whatever. So this is not the username, this is just the identifier. And now we can select a user. So actually, you should create a new user for Loki and just give this user the privileges to access just the Loki application. This is probably the most secure way to do it. However, I'm lazy. I'm just going to pick my super administrative user and will just use that for the token. I still need to authenticate with a password, but I, in theory, have all the privileges. So click on app password, so we don't need a token in here. And you can give it a description if you want and expire it in a specific day. So this is also recommended. I just disable expiring because otherwise I have to recreate all of this stuff and I don't like this. So now at first I was a bit confused. I was asking myself, where the hell is the password? So I didn't see it yet. But you just have to select the identifier that you have just created, the app password, and just click on copy token. So this will display the password that has been randomly generated. So our username is the user that we have selected for the app password and the token that will show up in here. We will test this with Grafana first. So if we go back to Grafana, we go to data sources, Loki. So now if we try to save and test without any authentication, you can see unable to connect with Loki because we need to fill in the HTTP basic auth. Luckily, you can do this very easily here in authentication. Just go to basic authentication, copy the application password or the token, and then fill it in here as well. So now we can click on save. So now you definitely need the basic authentication to access the logs and also to send logs to our Loki service. This is pretty cool. Of course, we need to change the logging driver information because this is trying to send the logs without basic authentication. But this is also pretty simple. Just go back to the Nginx container, just take it down, and then in here, just add the username after the HTTPS in here, before the URL column, then the application password and an @ So username, column, password, @ and then the location, the URL. All right, let's save it and let's try if it works. Let's restart the container and let's go back to Grafana. We should see new log entries arriving right now at the server. So let's go back. And Nginx one, let's show the logs. And yeah, there you can see that this has just arrived in the last minute here. That's perfect. So this works. Of course, I need to repeat the same for the Traefik container as well, because this is not sending any logs. First of all, I'm going to take the container down, of course. Change the password in here. And yep, we're done. Now we should also see when we refresh it. Yeah, Traefik logs are also coming back. All right, cool. One thing I will say, though, it's not a good idea to put the password in the compose file, but you can use environment variables. So you can add password user and then add a .env file in your project and then, yeah, securely store the credentials with the right privileges so that you don't accidentally expose the application password and user in your compose projects. All right, cool. So I think there's just one more thing I wanted to show you, and don't worry, it's gonna be simple. So just another 5-6 minutes maybe, because we need to talk about Promptail. And this is another application. So this ships the content of the local logs of your server. So when you go to a Linux server, it's usually stored at the var log location in here. So there you have all kinds of server logs, like the syslog. You might have dpkg logs for the package manager in Linux. You have the d messages. And I think the most simple way to do this is with Promptail. Again, there are different log collectors. It's probably going to replace with Grafana Alloy at some point in the future, but I think Promptail will stay around for a longer time. Here is a note: Promptail is feature complete, so all feature development will occur in Grafana Alloy, so don't expect any updates to this agent anymore. But I think it's a good way to start, right? So of course, I've also created a boilerplate for Promptail, so you don't need to mess around with the documentation. Just go in the boilerplates, scroll down to Promptail, and then use the compose project here. Again, it's pretty simple because it's just a simple agent, but I will create a new directory for it, prompt-tail. I will create a new compose file, paste the information from my boilerplates. Again, it expects a configuration file, so in here, just creating a new folder. And in the boilerplates, I also have prepared a simple config file that will scrape all the logs from the var log directory. So again, you can customize this to your specific needs. So you can create multiple jobs here for any application log that is written to the disk. You can also add different target machines, so connect to a different host and collect logs from a different location in a different and custom format. I will just try to keep it simple and collect all the logs from var log and store it in one job that is called var logs. But technically, for better organization, you might want to create a specific job for the syslog, for the dmessage, for the package logs, and attach different job labels to it. But yeah, this is just a quick and dirty example, so don't worry about it. Just need to change the client information. So here again, you can see this is the URL, and that expects username, password, and Loki FQDN. So we will just copy it from the Nginx compose file that we have configured. I think that should be fine. Okay, and start this project. It's pulling down the prompt-tail image, starting the agent, and it's immediately starting to scrape the server logs and sending it to Loki. All right, so that's it. Let's go back to Grafana and see if the logs are arriving. I'm just going to refresh, and here they are. Again, it's just one job for all the different logs, but you still can go in here and search in the log files for something specific. If we go to labels, you can see that there is a label for the file name. In the file name, you can filter for these specific logs. There's a value for the alternatives.log, for the bootstrap.log, for the cloud init log. And here we can just click on include or exclude. So for example, if you want to only see the logs from the var syslog, click on include. Let's go back to logs. Here above, you can see the file name filter is attached. And here we only see logs that have been written to the var log syslog file. And this is how you can filter through all the different logs and find exactly what you're looking for. And yeah, I know this was quite a journey, but I hoped it helped you to set up Grafana Loki as your central log management system, and understand how to configure it, to work with Docker containers, even add prompt-tail to collect system logs, and the best part, it is all secured with proper authentication through Authentik and encryption using Traefik. So I'll definitely be testing this extensively in my home lab over the next months, because I need to figure out a couple of other things, like how large does the database actually become when I collect logs over a few months period of time? How do I set up proper retention limits? So I probably want to compress the logs after a few years, or I want to throw them away after 3-4 years. This is what we haven't covered today, so there are a lot more things that we could cover about Grafana Loki, which are, I think, essentially for long-term use, but I think this is at least a good way to start. So if you're interested in more advanced topics like setting up alerts or configuring different data sources, collect Kubernetes logs, for example, so let me know in the comments below. And of course, stay tuned for future videos about Grafana Loki that will definitely come out this year. As always, if you've made it until the end, thank you so much for watching, everybody. A big shout out goes to the supporters and members of our community, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Take care. Bye bye.